They pulled me out of the wreckage of the Hammond 7 weeks after the collectors took us, and the first thing I said to the rescue crew was that I wanted a cigarette and a court-martial, in that order. They gave me the cigarette. The court-martial never came, though I asked for it twice more. Command decided they preferred a living embarrassment to a dead martyr, and so they promoted me instead, which is the military's oldest and most reliable way of shutting a man up. I am going to tell you what happened out there in the dark beyond the Meridian transit lanes because someone should, and because the men who were with me deserve to have it said plainly. Most of them didn't come home. The ones who did don't much like to talk about it, which I understand. I'm not sure I like it either, but here it is. My name is Tony McVeigh. I was a test pilot attached to the Frontier Development Authority's experimental drive program. That is a long title for a short job description. I flew things that weren't finished being built yet, at speeds that hadn't been certified yet, in conditions that the engineers hadn't fully calculated yet, and I came back and told them what went wrong. I was good at it. I was also unmarried, which mattered more than my skill rating, because the FDA had a quiet policy about not sending family men on the experimental runs. They never said so in writing. They didn't have to. The drive program was called the Q series. Q for quiet, because the whole point was a resonance-suppressed engine signature. A ship that could run dark across a transit lane without broadcasting her position to everything in the quadrant that was listening. The collectors were listening to everything. Everyone knew it. The brass said we were still in a posture of non-engagement. What that meant in practice was that we sent ships out and they didn't come back, and we called it equipment malfunction and opened another investigation. 7 ships in 14 months, 7 crews, not one piece of wreckage recovered, not one distress signal received, 7 ships gone as cleanly as if they'd been erased. Let me tell you what 7 ships means, because the number by itself does not carry the weight. It means 71 people, at standard crew complement, although 3 of the 7 runs had been undercrewed on purpose, because the program was making economical decisions about how many lives it could be seen to risk at once. 71 names in a roster that I had memorized, not because command asked me to, but because I felt it was the correct thing to do. The correct accounting. You send people into a situation that kills them and you carry the count. That is not sentiment. That is a form of precision. 7 ships means 14 months of command, telling the public that the Q-Series program was experiencing developmental delays attributable to the technical challenges inherent in cutting-edge propulsion research. It means 14 months of families being informed, in language carefully designed to be simultaneously soothing and uninformative, that their husbands and sons and brothers had been involved in an incident during a test flight, and that the investigation was ongoing. As though it were a matter of paperwork, rather than 71 people who went out and did not come back. It means that I sat in the ready room at the Cornish facility on 6 separate occasions and watched a crew board a ship that I had a reasonable expectation was going to disappear, because I understood what was happening even if command had not yet decided to say so officially, and I had said nothing because I did not know anything actionable, only something terrible, which is a different thing and a less useful one. 7 ships. I'd known 3 of the pilots personally. Barton from the Guildford station, a quiet Scotsman who always lost at cards but never stopped playing. Price from the 2nd cohort, who could talk about engine harmonics for 2 hours without repeating himself. And Hendricks, who'd been my bunkmate on the Callaway platform for 6 months the year before, and who had a laugh you could hear through 2 sealed bulkheads. None of them sent so much as a last transmission. They were just there, and then they were not. I will be honest with you. I did not believe the official explanation. Equipment malfunction does not take 7 ships in 14 months without leaving debris. It does not take crews who knew what they were doing. The Q-Series drives were experimental, yes, but they were not that experimental. Something was pulling those ships out of the sky, and command either knew what it was or was working very hard not to find out. That is where Barrett comes in. Director Barrett ran the FDA's drive program from a facility on the Cornish coast of England, a long, low building overlooking a gray sea that always seemed to be deciding whether to storm or not. He was a compact, methodical man who wore the same style of collar every day and answered questions with other questions. I respected him in the way you respect a man who has given himself over entirely to a single purpose and stopped pretending to have interests beyond it. He was not, I thought, someone who concealed things easily. He was the kind of man who believed that transparency was efficient. He was also the kind of man that someone had gotten to. I say this without knowing, at that point, the specifics. I learned the specifics later, after the debriefs, after the investigation that command opened not long after our return, the one that went quiet and then got very loud and then got quiet again in the way that investigations do when they find something large and inconvenient. What I knew at the time was simpler and more operational. The 7 ships had been taken cleanly, without any apparent struggle or evasion, which meant either that the pilots had been incapable of evasion, which I refused to believe, knowing the men I knew, or that someone had told the collectors what to listen for and where to listen. The Q-7's engine harmonic profile had been filed with 3 offices before we flew. I thought about that a great deal later. I didn't know that yet when he called me in for the Q-7 assignment. I sat across from him in that low-ceilinged office with the rain coming sideways off the channel, and he laid it out. The Q-7 was the most advanced drive prototype we had, capable of sustained dark running at a transit range no human ship had achieved. The test flight would take me out past the meridian boundary and back. 6 hours. Crew of 5 including myself. If the run was clean, we'd have the data to put 12 more ships in production within the year. He didn't mention the 7 missing crews. I noticed that he didn't mention them. I asked anyway. He said the investigations were ongoing. I asked what he thought had happened to them. He looked at the rain for a moment, and then he said the data was inconclusive. His face when he said it was the face of a man telling the truth about what the data showed while knowing that the data was incomplete by design, and being unable to say so, and finding the entire position uncomfortable but not uncomfortable enough to step out of it. I have met that face many times in my career. It is the face of a person standing on a line they drew themselves, discovering that the line is thinner than it looked when they drew it. I told him I'd take the flight. I want to be clear about why. It wasn't heroism. I've met heroic men, and I'm not one of them. Heroic men have a quality of not quite believing the danger is real, which makes them either very brave or very stupid depending on how things turn out. I believed the danger was entirely real. I took the flight because 7 pilots I knew, including one man who was my friend, had gone out on runs just like this one, and someone needed to go back out there and find out what had happened to them. That is not heroism, that is stubbornness. There is a difference. My crew for the Q-7 were Fletcher, my co-pilot, a lean, quiet man from Yorkshire who flew with the particular calm of someone who had decided not to be afraid of anything he couldn't control. Dobbs, my engineer, who was 24 and brilliant and talked too much when he was nervous, which meant he was always talking. Reeve, my systems operator, a former naval rating who had lateral transferred to the drive program and still moved around a ship like he was expecting it to roll under him. And Marsh, who handled communications and emergency systems, and had large, steady hands and a face like a man who'd seen enough to have opinions about most things. We launched out of the Cornish facility on a Thursday morning in March, under a sky the color of old iron. No ceremony, no send-off beyond Barrett standing at the end of the pad watching us go. I thought at the time that he looked like a man watching something he knew he couldn't stop. I filed that observation and flew the ship. The first 2 hours were perfect. The Q-7 ran dark and clean, her resonance signature suppressed to nearly nothing, the drive harmonic smooth as anything I'd flown. Dobbs kept up a running commentary from the engineering console that I mostly tuned out. Fletcher flew when I rested and rested when I flew. Reeve tracked our transit corridor with the quiet focus of a man used to tracking the sea. Marsh ran systems checks and reported nothing. We crossed the meridian boundary at the 3-hour mark. This was the limit of certified transit. Everything past this point was what the navigation charts labeled, with the particular detachment of cartographers who don't fly, as frontier contested space. What it meant was, the collectors had been confirmed active in this region, and whatever rules of engagement applied closer to home did not reliably apply out here. It was 30 minutes past the boundary when the drive began to act strangely. Not fail, not at first, just wrong. The resonance suppression held, but there was a new note in it, a frequency that didn't match the engine output. Dobbs caught it first, which is to say he went from talking too much to not talking at all, which was how you knew something had his full attention. He said, "There's a signal riding on top of our own." I said, "Show me." He showed me. It was a carrier wave, very clean, very precise, woven into the Q drive's own resonance frequency at a level so subtle that you wouldn't have found it without the specific harmonic profile we happened to be generating. It wasn't jamming us. It was listening to us. More than that, it was using our own engine signature as a conduit, bouncing off us and propagating outward, and whatever was on the other end of that signal would be getting a very precise picture of our location, our heading, and our speed. I looked at it for a long moment. The signal was elegant. I will give them that. It was extraordinarily elegant. It had been keyed to our specific drive harmonic, which meant whoever had placed it had access to the Q7's engine specifications, and had modified the carrier to fit so precisely that it would be undetectable without the exact resonance profile of the engine it was riding. You wouldn't find it on a standard sweep. You'd only find it if you were specifically looking at your own engine output, with the kind of close attention that Dobbs had been paying, because that was how Dobbs worked. Not because he suspected anything, but because close attention was his default orientation toward machines that interested him. It had been placed before we flew. It was not something the collectors had done to us in space. It had been placed in the ship, on the ground, by someone who knew what they were doing and what they were looking for. "How long has it been riding us?" I asked. Dobbs worked the calculations. Minimum 40 minutes, possibly since we crossed the boundary. I looked at Fletcher. Fletcher looked at me. Neither of us said the obvious thing, which was, someone had told them we were coming and they had been ready. This was not equipment malfunction. This was not a series of unconnected accidents. Someone had filed the Q-Series engine specifications with the wrong office, or the right office that had the wrong man in it, and 7 crews had been handed over so smoothly that not one of them had seen it coming, because they hadn't known to look. I was angry. I will not pretend otherwise. It was a clean, cold anger, the kind that does not express itself because expression would cost too much, and I filed it away where I kept things that needed to wait. I should have turned the ship around at that point. Looking back, and I have had a great deal of time to look back, I should have gone dark on every system I could, reversed course, and run for the boundary at whatever speed the drive could give me. I know that now. At the time I made a different calculation. If we ran, we'd learn nothing, and whatever had been taking our ships would keep taking them. We'd gotten further than any of the missing crews. We had active telemetry data. We had Dobbs's signal analysis. We had information that might finally explain what was happening out here. I told Marsh to record everything. I told Reeve to track every contact he could find. I kept us on course. We had 11 minutes before the engines went out. Not catastrophically. That is the thing I remember most clearly. It was not violent, not explosive, nothing that any of our emergency protocols were designed to address. The drive simply ceased to produce thrust. One moment it was running, the next it was not, and there was no alarm, no cascade failure, no warning. The Q7 went from flight to drift in the space between one breath and the next. In the silence that followed, Dobbs made a sound that was not quite a word. Then the lights changed. The running lights, the instrument panels, the emergency backup strips, everything shifted from their normal frequencies into a flat, even illumination that seemed to have no source, as if the light were coming from the air itself. It was a cold light. It made the inside of the cockpit look like a room in a facility you'd be glad to leave. Reeves said very quietly, "Contact, multiple, coming up fast from bearing 270. I looked at the scope. There were shapes there, angular and large, moving with a precision that no ship of that size should have been able to manage. They were not accelerating, they were simply there, as if they'd been placed rather than driven, as if someone had decided where they needed to be and they had been there. The collectors. I had seen images. Everyone who flew past the meridian boundary had been shown the recognition files, the official ones, compiled from long-range surveillance and the testimony of pilots who'd gotten close enough to see them and fast enough to get away. Angular was the word people always used. Angular and vast, and made of something that wasn't metal, not exactly, something that had a lattice quality to it, crystalline or perhaps biological. It was hard to say. They absorbed light rather than reflecting it. They absorbed everything, apparently, including our ships. What the images didn't convey, what I understood the moment I saw them on the scope, and more so the moment they were close enough to see with the eye rather than the sensor, was the quality of their movement. There was no propulsion visible, no exhaust, no thruster signature, no mechanical explanation for how they moved. They changed position the way an idea changes position in the mind, not traveling from one point to another, but simply being somewhere new, with a process intervening that was too small or too fast or too alien in its physics to be observed in any conventional way. They did not arrive. They were simply there, and then closer, and then present, and the distinction between those states was not gradual. 3 of them. The largest was perhaps 400 meters along its longest axis, if the concept of a longest axis applied cleanly, which it didn't exactly. Its geometry had a way of confusing the eye about which dimension was dominant. The other 2 were smaller, configured around the large one in a relationship that was not quite triangular and not quite linear, and which gave the impression of precision in its arrangement without suggesting any obvious tactical function. There were 3 of them, Fletcher said, with the calm of a man who has decided not to be afraid of anything he cannot control. Well, that was all he said. I found it appropriate. The Q-7 began to move. Not under her own power, we had no power. She moved because something had taken hold of her, some field or tether we couldn't see, and we were being drawn toward the largest of the 3 shapes the way a piece of iron is drawn toward a magnet. Slowly, without drama. The collectors were patient. They had no reason not to be. I told the crew to seal their suits. I told Marsh to keep recording. I told Dobbs to document everything he could see from the engineering panel for as long as the panel remained operational. I told Reeve to find anything that still worked and try to get a signal out. Reeve tried for 4 minutes. Nothing got through. The same field that had killed our drive was absorbing our communications, our transponder, every electromagnetic emission from the ship. We were, as far as the rest of humanity was concerned, already gone. I thought about Hendricks, his laugh that went through 2 sealed bulkheads. The largest collector opened to receive us. Opened is the wrong word, but I don't have a better one. The hull, or whatever served that function, did not iris or hinge or slide. It simply became permeable, the lattice structure of it relaxing, making space, and we passed through it the way you'd pass a hand through water, and it closed behind us with the same lack of ceremony. Inside was dark, then it wasn't. That same sourceless flat illumination. The Q-7 sat in a space that was large enough to hold a dozen ships our size, and it held 4 others besides ours. I recognized 2 of them. The Barton-class designation on one and the hull configuration of what had been the Price-Run's ship, slightly deformed but identifiable. Our people, our ships, collected and held in the dark. They keep them, Dobbs said. He was not talking to anyone. Get away from the windows, I said. We suited up fully, ran what internal systems we could on battery backup. Environmental, primarily, since the collector's field seemed disinterested in interrupting our life support. And then we sat in the dark of the hold, and I tried to think. Here is what I knew. 7 crews before us had been taken the same way we were taken. The ships were here. That meant the crews were here or had been here or were somewhere else inside this vessel. The collectors had not destroyed us immediately. They had taken us deliberately, carefully, with no apparent urgency, which meant they wanted something. You don't collect 7 complete ships along with their crews if you are simply eliminating a threat. You do it if you want to study what you've caught. Specimens, that was the word that came to me. We were specimens. I told the crew what I was thinking. Fletcher said that was a reasonable assessment. Dobbs said several things in rapid succession that I won't repeat here. Reeve was quiet for a moment and then said, "So what do we do about it?" That was the right question. That was the only question. We began with what we had. A ship with no drive and limited power. 5 men in full suits. The tools in the emergency kit, standard, which meant cutting implements, emergency beacons that wouldn't penetrate the field, medical supplies, restraints, and 1 single-charge plasma cutter rated for hull work. 1 sidearm mine, which I had brought against regulations, and which Barrett had pretended not to notice when I signed out the flight manifest. He had an expression when he'd looked at it. Not approval exactly, more a calibrated failure to notice that I took as the closest thing to endorsement his position allowed him. We also had the other ships. I want to spend a moment on the logistics of what happened next, because I think people who weren't there tend to imagine it as more improvised than it was. They imagine 12 people in a dark hold running on adrenaline and instinct, doing something reckless because there was nothing else left. That is not what happened. What happened was that we spent the better part of 20 hours working the problem with every tool of thought and calculation we had, and the plan we arrived at was methodical, was grounded in observable data, and was, by the time we committed to it, the product of 3 engineers, 2 experienced pilots, and a systems operator who had been studying the problem, as it turned out, for 6 months before we arrived. The recklessness was in the commitment. The plan itself was sound. I will not pretend I was certain of that at the time. I was not certain of anything except that staying was not a viable option in the long run, and that the only direction available to us was through. I have found, over the years, that this is a more common position than people admit. Most situations that look like choices are not really choices. They are clarifications. The situation removing every option except the one that was always there, the one you were going to have to take, waiting for you to stop looking for alternatives and start doing the work. We did the work. I got Dobbs suited and outside the Q7 in under 20 minutes, the 2 of us working across the hold floor under that flat cold light, moving toward the Barton-class ship. I had no idea if the collectors were watching. I had no idea if they had anything that corresponded to watching. The silence in the hold was absolute except for our own breathing and the faint sounds of our boots on what served as the floor, a surface that was hard and slightly textured, and not quite any material I recognized. The Barton ship was intact. Her airlock responded to manual override, because it was a military airlock and military airlocks are designed on the assumption that you might someday be trying to get in without power. Inside, the same flat light, the same silence. Life support was functional on battery backup, or perhaps on whatever power the collectors were feeding to keep their collection preserved. In the crew compartment, we found 6 men. They were alive. I want to make that absolutely clear. They were alive. They were in their suits sealed and they were alive, and when we got their visors up and spoke to them, 3 of them responded immediately. The other 3 came around slower but came around. Barton himself was one of the 3 who answered right away, the quiet Scotsman, looking thinner and grimmer than the last time I'd seen him, but entirely himself. He said, "McVeigh." I said, "The one and only." He said, "Took you long enough." I cannot fully describe what it was to hear that voice in that place. 6 months, and Barton sounded like a man who had spent 6 months being mildly inconvenienced. There was no collapse in him, no unraveling. He looked at me with the same steady, slightly skeptical attention he had always given to things he had not yet decided to trust, which included most things, and he nodded once the way he nodded in the ready room when you'd gotten a briefing right. He introduced me to the 5 men with him as though we were meeting at a transfer station, and not inside the hold of an alien vessel in contested space. He remembered their names and ranks correctly, which I would not have bet on after 6 months. He was precise about which berths they'd been keeping to, what their store's situation was, which systems were still drawing on battery backup, and which had gone dark in the first month. He had kept notes of his own in his head, because he'd had nothing to write with, and he delivered them like a status report. That was when I understood something important. They were not broken. 6 months in the dark, in the silence, whatever the collectors had done to study them or measure them or process them, they were not broken. Barton had been sitting in that ship in the dark, and he was still exactly Barton. It should not have surprised me. I had known him long enough to know he was not the kind of man who broke. I had just never had occasion before to know what 6 months in an alien hold would do to that quality of his, and now I knew. Nothing. Absolutely nothing. I asked him what the collectors had done to them specifically. He said it was hard to describe with complete precision, because the first time they'd been removed, about 3 weeks in, he thought, though tracking time had grown difficult without a proper cycle. The process had involved a kind of disorientation that made accurate observation hard, a field effect of some kind that made the world feel sideways. Not painful exactly. More like the feeling of trying to remember a word you know perfectly well, extended over the entire surface of your body for a period of perhaps 2 hours. The second time, 4 weeks later, had been cleaner. They'd walked through what Barton described as a corridor of sensation, pressure, temperature variations, something that registered against the skin like fine vibration at frequencies that moved systematically through a range. Diagnostic, he thought. Medical possibly, if that concept applied to what the collectors did. An inventory. After that, nothing. 2 visits in 6 months and then silence. They were not fed. They maintained themselves on the ship's emergency stores, which had been designed for 48 hours, and had lasted 6 months through careful rationing that Barton had managed with the same methodical precision he managed everything. They were not communicated with. They were not harmed. They were simply held in the flat light, in the silence, in the dark beyond the meridian boundary, and the collectors had apparently decided that whatever they needed to know about the specimens in the Barton-class ship, they had extracted it and moved on. "Did you try to get out?" I asked him. 12 times, he said, counted. "And the hull is not amenable to standard cutting tools," he said, "or non-standard ones. We tried the emergency plasma cutter on a panel section that Erickson thought might be thinner. Erickson's an engineer. He has instincts about materials. The cutter made a mark. 1 mark. After that it stopped making marks. The field. Everything we had that operated on electromagnetic principles became ineffective within 30 seconds of contact with the hull. Mechanical tools, no effect for a different reason. The material is not metal, it's not composite in any category I recognize, and it does not respond to mechanical force the way any material I've encountered responds. Erickson has a theory about it." "What's his theory?" "He thinks it's not a static material at all. He thinks it responds to contact and redistributes stress throughout the whole structure, so that any force you apply locally gets dissipated across the entire hull before it can cause damage at the point of application." Barton paused. "He describes it as a conversation. You push, it listens. It spreads the answer around so that no single point has to deal with you. I thought about that for a moment. What if you pushed everywhere at once? I said. Barton looked at me steadily. I don't have enough men to push everywhere at once. What if you didn't push mechanically? I said. What if the push was a field, something that propagated through the whole structure simultaneously? He was quiet for a moment. He had a way of being quiet that felt like active work. I don't have that either, he said. I might, I said. I told him we were getting out. He said, through what exactly? I didn't have a full answer for that. What I had was the plasma cutter, a sidearm, 6 more men, and the inventory of 2 additional ships. I also had the knowledge that the collectors had a field that suppressed drives and communications, but that it had done nothing to our internal systems, our tools, or our suits. They were not, apparently, concerned with what we did inside the collection hold. Why would they be? They had a hull around us that was, as far as they knew, impermeable. They had our drives locked down. Where were we going to go? We went to Price's ship next. Price was not among the living. I found that out from the survivors there, and I took a moment with it before I moved on, because Price had been good and it deserved a moment. But there were 4 of his crew alive, and one of them was his systems operator, a woman named Tallies who had been methodically, obsessively, keeping handwritten notes on everything she'd observed about the collectors for the entire 6 months she'd been held. Paper notes, in a logbook from the ship's emergency kit, because she'd had nothing else. I read 20 pages of those notes standing in Price's crew compartment. They were extraordinary. Tallies had noted the timing of every interaction the collectors had made with the held ships. She had mapped the frequency and pattern of the field that suppressed their drives. She had observed, through the viewport of Price's ship, in the flat light of the hold, something that might have been collectors moving through the space. She had 3 pages of diagrams. She had also written, in smaller and more careful handwriting than the rest of the notes, a section she had titled simply, What I Know for Certain. 4 pages. The distinction she drew was precise. Everything else in the logbook was observation, inference, or question. This section was only things she could confirm had happened, as opposed to things she believed had happened or thought she understood. She had separated fact from interpretation with a rigor that would have done credit to a formal research environment. I think I will keep that distinction with me for the rest of my life. What I know for certain, not very much in any given moment, but enough, usually enough. The confirmed facts included: the field was present and continuous from the time the ships arrived. The field was not uniform. She had temperature variance data suggesting gradients. The collectors had made 2 visits, consistent with what Barton had told me. The ship's life support had been maintained, which was active intervention, not passive neglect. And one more thing which she had underlined. She had underlined it twice. The field, she wrote, was stronger near the hull. Near the interior walls of the hold, it was intense enough that she had felt it as a physical pressure through her suit when she'd walked close. But in the center of the space, equidistant from the hull on all sides, it was weakest. She had mapped this with the suit's internal sensors over the course of weeks, triangulating the variance. The numbers were in the margin in precise, small figures. I looked up from the logbook and found Tallies watching me read. She was watching my face. Specifically, the way someone watches a person reading something they have written when they need to know whether the reader understands the implication. She was perhaps 35, with the kind of steadiness in the eyes that comes from a long time spent watching things carefully and deciding what they mean. I said, the center of the hold. She said, yes. I said, how precise is this variance mapping? She said, as precise as suit sensors allow, which is not laboratory grade, but the gradient is consistent across 63 separate measurements taken at different times of what I estimated to be day and night cycles, which means it is not an artifact of a single reading. 63 measurements, I said. I had time, she said, without any particular inflection. I showed the diagram to Dobbs. He looked at it for a long time, then he looked at me. "If there's a variance in the field," he said carefully, "there might be enough headroom in the center of the hold for a low-power drive pulse. Enough to break through the hull. Not a chance. Enough to do something else." He thought about it. "Maybe, depending on what something else needs to be." We went back to the Q7. 11 men now, moving across the hold in the flat light, nobody speaking much. I posted Marsh and Reeve at the Q7's airlock watching for any sign of collector activity. There was none. Whatever they were doing elsewhere on the vessel, they were not watching their collection. Dobbs and Fletcher and I sat in the engineering compartment and worked out what we could do with a low-power drive pulse in the center of a hold this size. The answer, after 2 hours of calculation and argument, was specific and strange. The Q-series drive produced a resonance field of its own as a byproduct of ignition, a field that, for the first fraction of a second before the drive fully engaged, operated at a frequency that Dobbs described as being in a fundamentally different register from the collector field. Not stronger, different, like a key that doesn't overpower a lock but operates at the tumbler level. The collectors had built their suppression system to cancel human drive signatures. They'd had 6 months of samples to work with. They had done it well, but the Q7 was experimental. Its drive harmonics were unlike anything that had flown before it, and in the first fraction of a second ignition pulse, before the main drive attempted to engage and was suppressed, there would be a window. A window of perhaps 2 seconds. 2 seconds of maneuvering thrust, I said. In the center of the hold, what can we do with it? Fletcher said without particular emphasis, "Ram the hull." We looked at him. "Full acceleration for 2 seconds in the center of the hold," he said. "If the field variance is what Tally says it is, the drive pulse won't be fully suppressed at initiation. 2 seconds at full Q7 thrust, pointed at the weakest section of hull." "The ship will be destroyed on impact," Dobbs said. "Yes," Fletcher said. "We'll be inside the ship." "Not if we're not," Fletcher said, which was the most useful piece of circular logic I have heard in a life that has included a considerable amount of it. Here is what we did. We stripped the Q7 down to essentials. We removed everything portable that could be used for propulsion in the few seconds of chaos we were going to create. We identified the weakest point in the collector hull based on Tally's mapping, which indicated a section near what appeared to be a structural juncture, thinner, or at least less dense, than the rest. We positioned the other 2 recovered ships on either side of that section, crewed, with the best engineering talent I had available, including Tally's herself, working on the theory that if we punched a hole in the collector hull, the resulting pressure differential might do additional work for us. Then we got the collector's attention for the first time. This was Barton's idea. He pointed out that the collectors had removed crew members from the ships twice during his captivity, and had done so through a particular section of the hold that had temporarily become permeable in a way that was different from how the main entry worked. He had marked the location. He suggested that if we wanted to draw collector attention toward one end of the hold, we should do something at that end. What we did was set off every emergency beacon on every ship simultaneously. They wouldn't penetrate the field, but they would create electromagnetic noise inside the hold, and anything sensitive to electromagnetic signals, which the collectors clearly were, given the sophistication of their suppression field, would know that something was happening. They came. 4 of them, moving through the permeable section at Barton's marked location, moving toward the noise source at the far end of the hold. They looked like nothing I have words for, large, angular, articulated in ways that made the geometry of them hard to track, surfaces that absorbed the flat light rather than reflecting it. They moved with the same precision they flew with, a placed, not driven, each position chosen rather than arrived at. I watched them from the Q7's cockpit and I was afraid. I will not tell you I was not afraid. I was afraid in the clean, clarifying way that you are afraid when the situation is finally exactly as bad as you thought it was, and there are no more ways to be surprised. It is almost a relief, that kind of fear. Fletcher was in the pilot's seat. I was standing at the airlock. 11 people were braced in the 2 flanking ships and in the safest corners of the hold itself. Fletcher looked back at me. I said no. The Q-7's drive ignited. It was not a full ignition. It was the first pulse, the pre-ignition resonance burst, the fraction of a second that existed before the suppression field could identify and cancel it. But in that fraction of a second, in the center of the hold where the field was thinnest, the Q-7 moved. Not for long, not fast enough by any rational calculation to do what we needed it to do. Except the Q-series drive was an experimental resonance engine, and its ignition pulse operated at a harmonic frequency. The collectors had not had 6 months to study, because the Q-7 was the first of its kind to fall into their hold. And when that pulse hit the section of hull tallies had identified, something happened that Dobbs later described as an interference pattern. The human resonance and the collector field interacting at the structural juncture the way 2 waves interact, reinforcing rather than canceling, concentrating at a single point. The hull did not simply crack. It unraveled. A section 4 meters across dissolved into its component lattice, and the vacuum of space made an argument on our behalf that was immediate, decisive, and comprehensive. What happened next was loud. I had braced in the airlock of the Q-7, suited and tethered. The 2 flanking ships had their thrust systems, mechanical, not drive-based, maneuvering jets that operated entirely independently of the collector field running at maximum output. As the hull dissolved, they pushed through the gap, wedging it wider, and the pressure differential did the rest. 11 people in suits, tethered to ships that were now actively driving outward, through a gap in the hull of a collector vessel into the dark and the cold. The Q-7 was gone. She hit the far side of the lattice and came apart without any drama at all, which seemed right for a ship that had always been more useful as a proof of concept than as a vehicle. I got through the gap fourth. I know this because I counted. I needed to know how many of us were outside before I stopped waiting. There were 12 of us, 11 plus myself. Every living person from 3 ships in the dark, tethered together in a rough cluster, with 2 maneuvering jet ships pulling us away from the collector vessel at a rate that was steady but not fast. The collectors did not pursue us. I do not know why. Maybe the breach had caused systems failures that occupied their attention. Maybe, by some calculation I cannot fathom, we were not worth the expenditure. Maybe they were simply patient, certain that we had nowhere to go, and the breach was an anomaly they had already filed away under the category of phenomena to be studied later. That would be consistent with everything else I had observed about them. They were not reactive creatures. They were not angry creatures. They were thorough, methodical, and very long in their perspective on time. A hull breach and an escaped collection was, perhaps, a data point, not an emergency. It would be addressed in its proper order. I hope it kept them busy for a while. I hope they are still working through what they thought they knew, adjusting their models, revising their parameters, adding footnotes to the entry about the specimens that got out. I hope Dobbs's drive pulse is the kind of variable that takes them a long time to account for properly. He would appreciate that, I think. He would tell you so at considerable length. We had somewhere to go. Reeve had been working on the communications problem since before we made our move. He had determined, from Tallies's notes, that the suppression field propagated outward from the collector vessel in a sphere, and that its effective radius was finite. Tallies had calculated the rough boundary based on the point at which her internal suit sensors had stopped registering any interference during her own mapping exercise. 1 kilometer from the hull, Marsh fired every communications device we had left. A destroyer by the name of Holdsworth picked up the signal 40 minutes later. She had been running a search pattern at the meridian boundary for 3 weeks, dispatched by a man whose name I didn't know then and learned later, a particular senior intelligence officer who had been assigned to find out what was happening to the missing Q-series crews, and who had apparently been making a thorough nuisance of himself at every level of command until they gave him a ship to search with. The Holdsworth was a warship. She arrived with 2 escort frigates. Whatever the collectors made of that, they withdrew, taking what was left of their hold and whatever else they carried back into the frontier dark. We were recovered. I spent the next 4 days unable to sleep in any bed that wasn't the floor. I told 2 separate debriefing teams everything I have told you here, in more technical detail, and with references to Tallies's logbook, which had survived because Tallies had kept it inside her suit on her person since the moment the escape began. She knew what it was worth. So did Command, eventually, though they took longer to arrive at that conclusion than she or I would have liked. Barton was promoted. He didn't want to be promoted. He wanted to go back out on experimental runs, but Command had decided that a man who'd survived 6 months in a collector hold was more useful as a consultant than as a test subject. He argued about it for a year before they compromised and gave him a modified survey command that let him do both. That sounded about right for Barton. Tallies's notes became the foundation of what the program later called resonance doctrine, the understanding that the collector's suppression technology had specific frequency dependencies, and that the Q-series drives, precisely because they were experimental and strange, had harmonics that fell outside the collector's modeled range. The 12 ships that went into production that year were not standard Q-series. They were modified. Noisier, less elegant, deliberately operating in the specific frequency band that Dobbs and Fletcher had identified in that engineering compartment, while I stood behind them watching Tallies's diagram and trying to think. I went back out on experimental runs. Of course I did. I told you I was not a heroic man. Heroic men make decisions, stubborn men just keep going. The new drives were better. The doctrine was better. The collectors took 2 more of our ships in the following year, and both of those crews came home, not unharmed, not unchanged, but home. I never did get that court-martial. I filed the request again after the debrief, and was told that conducting an unauthorized rescue operation using experimental government property was not, technically, a court-martial offense if it worked. I said that was a terrible precedent to set. They told me to accept the promotion and stop complaining. Marsh retired. He went home to wherever men with large, steady hands and opinions about most things go home to, and I hope it was quiet there. Reeve transferred back to naval operations, which suited him. Dobbs went into the resonance research program and is still there, last I heard, still talking too much when he's nervous. Fletcher I kept flying with when I could arrange it. He had that quality I mentioned before, the particular calm of a man who has decided not to be afraid of anything he cannot control. That is a thing worth keeping close to you, in the dark beyond the meridian boundary, where the things that wait for you are large and angular and patient. The collectors are still out there. I want you to know that because there are people who would rather you didn't think about it. They are still out there, and they are still patient, and they still do not understand, quite, what they walked into when they started collecting us. That is the thing I would tell you if I could tell you only one thing. The collectors studied us for 6 months. They ran their scans and took their measurements and built their models, and what their models told them, I suspect, was that we were manageable, predictable, bounded by the limits of our technology and our biology, containable in a hold the size of the one they used. What their models did not account for was a man sitting in the dark of a dead ship for 6 months, refusing to consider the situation permanent. They did not account for a woman keeping handwritten notes in a logbook, because she had decided that understanding was more important than despair. They did not account for a pilot deciding to ignite an experimental drive in a confined space based on 2 seconds of window and a theory that was, by any reasonable standard, unlikely to succeed. They had never met us before, not really. They had collected us. They had studied us, but they had not met us. Not the way you meet something that refuses to be what you've categorized it as. The Holdsworth brought us home on a Tuesday. I remember the color of the sky over the Cornish facility when we came down. Gray, undecided, the sea beneath it the same color as it always was. Barrett was standing at the edge of the pad when we landed. He looked at me for a long moment without speaking. Then he nodded once, the way a man nods when something he calculated came out as he'd hoped, despite his better judgment. I didn't say anything to him then. I had things to say to him, and some of them were not polite, and I decided they would keep. I walked past him into the building, and I sat down in the first chair I found, and I closed my eyes, and for a long time I just listened to the rain on the windows and the sound of the sea, and I thought about Hendricks, and about Price, and about all the things you carry with you that you do not put down. You carry them forward, that is all. You carry them forward and you keep going because the dark is patient, and patience is the one thing we cannot afford to give it unchallenged. We keep going. That is what we do. That is, in the end, the only answer we have ever had. It has always been enough. I will tell you one more thing, because I think it matters, and because no one in command has seen fit to include it in any official record. When the Holdsworth pulled alongside us in the dark and sent over her launch to collect the 12 of us, her captain, a woman named Forsyth, whom I had never met and have not met since, came aboard personally to assess the situation. She looked at 12 people in suits, at 2 battered maneuvering, at hulks, at the drift of debris that was all that remained of the Q-7, and at the collector vessel withdrawing in the middle distance. She assessed all of this with the focused attention of someone who had trained for emergencies her entire career, and was now confronting something that no training had specifically addressed. Then she said, "Who's the senior officer?" I said that would be me. She looked at me, she looked at the collector vessel, she looked at me again. She said, "How?" I said we'd blown a hole in their hull using a harmonic interference pattern, derived from a pre-ignition drive pulse operating at an experimental resonance frequency that had not been modeled in the collector's suppression field parameters. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Right, everyone get aboard, we'll sort out the paperwork later." That, I think, is the correct response to most situations. I have tried to apply it ever since. The paperwork, for what it is worth, was considerable. There is a particular quality to the debrief process when you have done something that no established protocol covers. The officers assigned to debrief you are thorough and professional, and they write everything down with the careful penmanship of people who are privately aware that what they are writing down does not fit cleanly into any existing category. They ask their questions, and you answer them, and they nod at the appropriate moments. And at the end they thank you and they file their reports, and somewhere in an archive that I have never been cleared to read, there is a document that describes, in precise administrative language, how 12 human beings improvised their way out of an alien vessel using equipment that was not designed for that purpose, in conditions that were not supposed to be survivable, based on a theory that most of the people in that room would have told you beforehand was unlikely to work. Unlikely, not impossible. That is a distinction that matters more than people generally appreciate. The collectors had run probability calculations. I am certain of this. Whatever serves them for mathematics had modeled our situation and arrived at a number representing our chances of successful escape, and that number had been, by their calculation, negligible. Close enough to 0 to be treated as 0 for operational purposes. They were wrong, not because they made an arithmetic error. They were wrong because their model was complete. It accounted for our technology, our biology, our communications range, our power reserves. But it was complete in the way that a perfect map of a country is complete, accurate in every detail and missing the one thing that makes the country what it is, which is the people who live there, and what they will do when they decide the situation is unacceptable. The situation had been unacceptable. We had decided. That is the variable their model did not contain. In the months after we came home, I thought about that a great deal. Not with pride, because pride is not the right register for it. More with a kind of sober attention, the way you pay attention to something that could just as easily have gone the other direction. We had gotten out. Others had not. Price had not. Hendricks had not, and I still do not know what happened to Hendricks. Whether he was on one of the ships in that hold that carried no survivors, or whether he was taken somewhere else entirely, or whether the collectors had no more interest in him than they had in the ships themselves, once the data was extracted. I do not know. I have asked and been told that the investigation is ongoing, which is the answer you get when no one has found anything. I find I am not willing to treat that as a closed matter. I have said so to the people in a position to do something about it more than once, and I will continue to say so. Stubbornness, as I mentioned, is a characteristic feature of my nature. The program continued. The new ships flew. The resonance doctrine held mostly, with modifications as we learned more. The frontier boundary moved outward, slowly, ship by ship and year by year, which is how all frontiers move when you look at them honestly. Not in sweeping advances, but in the accumulated persistence of people who go back out after they have been stopped, who treat stopped as a temporary condition rather than a permanent one, who consider the next attempt to be more interesting than the last failure. That is not, I recognize, a policy. It is not a doctrine, or a strategy, or a plan. It is simply a disposition, the disposition of a species that evolved on a world that was trying to kill it, and learned to treat that as a starting condition rather than a deterrent. The collectors, I suspect, did not evolve that way. Whatever world made them, it did not make them stubborn. It made them precise and patient and certain of their calculations, and very good at modeling the systems they encountered. They are still learning that we are not, in any meaningful sense, a system. They will continue learning. We will continue making that lesson available. The rain comes off the channel today the same way it always has. The sea outside the Cornish facility is the same gray it was the morning we launched, still undecided about whether to storm. I have been back here 3 times since the Q7, and each time the sky looks like this, and each time I stand at the pad for a moment before going in, the way Barrett stood watching us go. I understand that now, what he was watching. He was watching the next attempt. He has seen enough attempts to know that they do not all come back, and he stands there anyway because what else do? You watch them go. You make the next one better. You stand in the rain and you wait for the signal, and when it comes, you send the ship. We keep sending the ships. That is the answer to their patience. It is the only answer we have. It is the one they did not model. And it is the one that will not stop.